I like to read, and this is the type of stuff I like to read when I do read. Very interesting book. So, I just thought today I might as well share a little excerpt out of this book by Thomas Sowell. Now, if you don't know who Thomas Sowell is, he is primarily a professor of economics, and he has done extensive studies on varieties of topics, including wealth inequality, wealth redistribution, gender identity. He is one of the first figures to have debunked the myth of the wage gap, and this was way back in the 60s. He debunked this way back then, and yet that particular argument, as you well know if you pay attention to social media, keeps coming up again and again and again and again and again. It's like somebody invents something and says, hey, this is a thing now, and somebody else, many other somebody else's, come along and they analyze that and say, well, yeah, sorry, that's really not a thing. It's not actually a thing. Well, Thomas Sowell did that with the wage gap myth way back in the 60s. And people keep coming back and saying, oh, the wage gap myth is a thing. Well, no, it's not. I mean, everybody kind of knows by now that it's not. So this particular passage gets into, and I apologize for the specs here, getting old, and your eyesight starts to go a little bit when you get older. And so anyhow, with this particular passage, it's dealing with the effects of different ideologies introduced into the school systems back in the 60s and 70s, in particular as it relates to blacks, into the black population of New York. So, I'll try and get through this quickly, but I just wanted to share this with you guys, just to, put this information out there. Now, I don't want to be plagiarizing, and this is for informational, educational purposes only. I am not trying to read excerpts of Thomas Sowell's book for the purpose of claiming that it's my own work. Quite the contrary, I'm just here to share this. Okay, so back in 1938, well, let me just give you a bit of history leading up to this. In this book, he's talking about 3 particular schools in New York City, high schools, that were a measure of how successful a person was going to be. If they were able to get into this high school, then chances are later on in life they'd get into an Ivy League school and go on to become somebody important in the world and do important things, like Jonas Salk, who wound up going to Stuyvesant, I think, and wound up developing a vaccine that eliminated polio. So, as an example, he's talking about the interests of particular groups and how those interests may or may not motivate them to become successful or to gain those credentials in higher education. So, he says, he talks a little bit about diversity as well. So it gets interesting. Passionate advocacy of interests of lagging minorities has seldom been followed by equally dedicated empirical investigation as to whether those minorities have actually benefited on net balance from the success of those advocacies. Planned Parenthood comes to mind right away. Now, we know that the federal government dumps a lot of money into these social programs, and Planned Parenthood is just one of these programs that claims to be of all kinds of benefits to people of color and minorities and women, and yet we don't really see those benefits, do we? So that's why, in the court of public opinion, agencies like Planned Parenthood really have no effectiveness and therefore no political clout. It's only the machinations and fantasies of the left that give them any political clout. So he goes on to say that the triumph of egalitarian principles and demographic diversity in the rest of New York's educational system has not resulted in an increase in the number of proportion of black or Hispanic students passing the admissions tests to get into Stuyvesant, Bronx Science, and Brooklyn Tech. On the contrary, the numbers and proportions of black and Hispanic students have declined substantially over the years in all 3 institutions. Okay, back in 1938, the proportion of blacks attending Stuyvesant High School was almost as high as the proportion of blacks in the city's population. So it was roughly equal. There was equal representation in Stuyvesant of the percentage of blacks to the population. But 1938 was the last year when this was true. The sharpest declines occurred in the second half of the 20th century when socioeconomic positions of blacks was far higher than in 1938. Interesting. As of 1979, blacks were 12.9% of the students at Stuyvesant. But in 1995, the New York Times reported that only 4.8% of the students at Stuyvesant were black. As of 2012, the New York Times reported that blacks were now 1.2% of the students at Stuyvesant. So in short, over a period of 33 years, the proportion of blacks gaining admission to Stuyvesant High School fell to just under 1/10 of what it had been before. None of the usual explanations of racial disparities, genetics, racism, poverty, or a legacy of slavery can explain this retrogression over time. Back in 1938, both racism and poverty were worse than in later times, and blacks of 1938 were generations closer to slavery. Clearly, something else was happening. To believers in either hereditary or environment where the environment is defined in the usual socioeconomic terms, there is no obvious or even plausible generic reason why blacks of an earlier generation should have been more able to meet demanding mental test standards to get into an elite public high school. As environmental explanations in socioeconomic terms, that's a tongue twister, socioeconomic terms, conditions have clearly improved among blacks since 1938. Both absolutely and relative to the general population. Now here's where Thomas Sowell gets a bit dicey in this next sentence. One of the few possibilities left is that the culture within the black communities has in some respect changed for the worse over the years. Well, now let's just think about that. The advent of pop culture, rap music, pop music, hip-hop, the glorification of drugs, rape culture, violence, and thuggery in general. I don't know, maybe that had a little bit to do with the contribution of the decline of black communities in America. I don't know. And yet even today they maintain roughly the same percentage of the population, and which is around 13 to 14%. 13.5% is the generally accepted percentage of blacks in America. And yet they commit a vastly disproportionate number of crimes relative to their population. So we know that there are some contributing factors to this decline that we see in the black community in America. I say it starts with the universities. They've been lied to about their condition, about their... the black community in the United States has had the disease of the, it's on the tip of my tongue. Low expectations, right? They've had low expectations pushed on them for decades by the liberal left, saying that, everybody was against them. Racism and slavery and institutional racism and all this stuff was created. Admissions into universities and education opportunities and employment via affirmative action, which is blatant racism against whites and Asians. You can throw Asians in there because Asians usually have to score 200 points higher on an SAT test than a black person does. Whites have to score only 50% higher. I forget what it used to be for Jews, but the bottom line is that black communities in America have been lied to by the Democratic left, by the liberal, Marxist, communist, socialist left, for the purpose of, votes and keeping the Democratic Party in power. I believe it was Lyndon B. Johnson that can be quoted as saying, "I'll have blacks voting Democratic for the next 200 years." So, this message isn't just for black people, it's just for anybody that has half a brain. Politicians lie to you. They lie to you so that you turn around and do things that keep them in power, and keep them in power over you and over your life. This is why I'm an anarchist. This is Well, I even hesitate nowadays to call myself an anarchist because then I get lumped up with that phony outrage group called Antifa, the anti-fascists, anti-fascists, or whatever they are. They're actual fascists, of course. We all know that. So just be aware of this sort of thing. I encourage anybody who's interested to take a look at Thomas Sowell's book. Again, the title is Wealth, Poverty, and Politics, an International Perspective. And it's a great read. It's a little bit challenging, but it's very interesting. I mean, he holds your attention really well, and he gives you the lowdown on a lot of these perceptions that seem to come from the media and get warped, because obviously, the mainstream media seems to think that blacks are the victims of everything and that whites are racist by virtue of being white. So just be aware of that, and if you do decide to pick up a copy of the book, I hope you enjoy it. This has been your host, Seamus McCarthy, the Terrible Tory, and I hope you're all having a great day. Check you later.